Before the sun found any reason to rise, the harbour lay still beneath a fog, so thick it seemed to hold the water in place. Nothing moved except the fog itself, drifting in slow, grey folds over black water, over slick pilings, over the hulls of ships that had not yet remembered they were vessels of ambition. This was the hour when a whaling port belonged to no one, not to the merchants who owned its ships, not to the wives who waited in white clapboard houses on the hill, not even to the sea that had carried so much away from this place and given so little back in return. It belonged, in these last dark minutes before dawn, only to itself. Ropes creaked against their cleats, with the patience of old men shifting in their sleep. Somewhere beneath the pier, water lapped at barnacled wood in a rhythm too slow to be called restless. The gulls, usually so quick to complain at the first hint of light, stayed silent in this hour, tucked into whatever ledges and rooflines offered shelter from the damp. Even they seemed to understand that dawn had not yet given permission for the day to begin. It was a silence that pressed gently on the ears, not the silence of emptiness, but of things gathering themselves. A town, a harbour, a fleet of ships, all waiting for the same grey light to arrive and set them into motion. Against one weathered pier, half swallowed by mist, a whaling ship rested at her berth, her hull dark with the accumulated years of salt and tar and travel. She had not moved in weeks, perhaps longer, but there was nothing idle in her stillness, only the appearance of it. Ships built for the taking of whales did not look restful, even at rest. Something in the set of their masts, the heaviness of their timbers, the way their rigging hung like the sleeping limbs of some vast, patient creature, suggested a purpose that mere anchorage could not entirely conceal. Her name was carved into the stern in letters gone soft with weather, some of them nearly lost beneath layers of salt spray and the slow erosion of paint that no one had thought urgent enough to renew. A passerby might have needed to lean close, might have needed to trace the shape of the letters with a finger to read what she was called, but the town knew her name without needing to look. Ships like her did not need reintroduction. They were known the way a neighbour is known, or a debt, or a grief. This was New England in the early decades of the 19th century, in the years when the hunting of whales had grown from a coastal trade into something closer to an empire built not on land or gold, but on oil, rendered from the bodies of the largest creatures the ocean had ever produced. Nantucket, and soon New Bedford after it, had become the twin hearts of this strange enterprise. Towns whose entire rhythm of life bent itself around the comings and goings of ships that might vanish over the horizon for 2 years, 3 years, sometimes longer, and return if they returned at all, heavy with barrels of oil that would light lamps and ocean away. It was a trade built on distance, on waiting, on the particular faith required to send men and ships toward horizons with no promise of when or whether they might come home. By this hour of the 1830s, or the 1840s depending on which harbour one stood in, whale oil had become something larger than a commodity. It had become a kind of invisible thread connecting this fog-bound New England pier to drawing rooms in London, to counting houses in Boston, to the workshops of men who oiled the gears of the earliest machines with what these ships would bring home. Somewhere across the ocean, in cities whose names these sailors might never speak aloud, oil lamps burned through the night in parlours and offices and streets, their flames fed by the same substance that would soon be boiled from blubber in iron tripods. It was a strange kind of intimacy, when one considered it, a lamp glowing in a stranger's window, lit by a creature hunted in waters the lamp's owner would never see, aboard a ship crewed by men whose names they would never know. The whale connected them all, without any of them quite understanding how. There was something almost holy in the way the fog held this harbour, apart from the rest of the waking world, as though granting it one final hour of quiet before the machinery of departure began to turn. Soon enough, lanterns would appear in windows along the waterfront. Soon enough, boots would sound on cobblestones still slick with the night's moisture, and voices, low at first, then rising, would begin to fill the spaces where only water and rope had spoken. But not yet. For now, the ship remained a silhouette, a shape more sensed than seen, and the town around her held its breath in the way that harbors do before a departure, before 100 small farewells compress themselves into a single grey morning. Few find comfort in this kind of quiet, in histories that unfold slowly, the way a fog lifts rather than the way a storm breaks. You may wish to stay a while longer and to return to this channel when next you need a voyage to carry you towards sleep. There is no need to do anything more than listen. The story will keep pace with you. It is worth pausing here in this hour before the harbour wakes to understand what these ships meant to the wider world, because the men who would soon walk down to her decks were not embarking on a voyage of mere curiosity or private adventure. They were embarking on something the whole of the industrializing world had come to depend upon, whether it knew the names of these ships or not. Whale oil, rendered patiently from blubber in the try-works of vessels just like this one, had become the fuel of visibility itself. It lit street lamps in cities where nights had once belonged wholly to darkness. It burned in the lighthouses that guided other ships safely past the very rocks and shoals that whaling vessels themselves had learned, through hard-won experience, to fear. It lubricated the machines of the new textile mills rising along New England's rivers, machines whose gears would have ground themselves to ruin without the fine, clean oil that whales alone seemed able to provide. Spermaceti, drawn from the great case in the head of the sperm whale, burned brighter and cleaner than any other oil known to the age, and it found its way into candles prized in the finest homes. Candles that burned without the acrid smoke of tallow, casting a light so pure it seemed almost to apologize for the violence that had produced it. This was the paradox that hung unspoken over every whaling port in these years, that something so gentle as lamplight, so essential to reading and writing, and the simple comfort of a lit room against the dark, should come from a pursuit so vast and dangerous, and, at its heart, so unflinchingly brutal. The people who lit their lamps with whale oil rarely thought of the ships that had made it possible. They did not picture the fog, or the creaking ropes, or the ship waiting at her pier with her name worn soft by salt. They simply lit their lamps and read by them, and went about their evenings, while somewhere far off, in a colder and wetter world, entirely their own, men were preparing to give years of their lives, sometimes all of their lives, to keep that light burning. The economics of it were staggering in scope, even if they moved slowly and without spectacle. Fortunes were built in these towns, not through single voyages, but through decades of accumulated risk, ships sent out again and again into the same distant waters, each return bringing barrels of oil that would be sold, refined, shipped onward to markets that stretched from Boston to Liverpool to ports further still. Merchants who owned shares in these vessels, for few men owned a whaling ship outright, the risk being too great for any single purse, watched the horizon with a particular kind of patience, knowing that 2 or 3 years might pass before they learned whether their investment had returned as oil or as nothing at all. The whaling industry did not reward haste. It rewarded endurance, in ships and in men and in the quiet nerves of those who waited on shore. And so the ship rested at her pier in the fog, indifferent for now to all of this, to the lamps she would fuel, to the fortunes she would make or fail to make, to the families already beginning to stir in the houses above the harbour. She was only wood and rope and tar in this hour, waiting the way ships always wait, without impatience, without dread, simply present in the dark, until the world found reason to move her. The fog would lift eventually. The gulls would find their voices. And somewhere in the sleeping town behind her, men were already rising from narrow beds, dressing in the cold, preparing to walk down to the water and sign their names to articles that would bind them to her. Fate, for years, they could not yet imagine. The town itself had grown the way coral grows, slow accretion around a single organizing purpose, until every street and steeple and stone wall seemed to lean subtly toward the harbor, as if the whole settlement had been built by hands that never quite forgot the sea was the reason for its existence. Whether it stood on the sandy isolation of Nantucket, ringed by shoals that made the harbor itself a kind of guarded secret, or spread along the mainland shore at New Bedford, where the Actionate River offered deeper water and easier passage for the larger ships the trade would eventually demand, it was a place whaling had made, board by board, in the way a species shapes its own habitat, until the habitat can sustain no other way of living. Walk its streets in that pale hour, before full light, when the fog still held the rooftops in soft suspension, and the evidence was everywhere, quiet and unremarked, because it had become so ordinary. The widows' walks atop the captains' houses, those small railed platforms where wives and mothers had once climbed to watch the horizon for sails that might or might not return. The counting houses along the wharves, their windows dark now, but soon to hold clerks, bent over ledgers thick with the arithmetic of risk and reward. The customs house, where duties were assessed on oil that had not yet been rendered from whales that had not yet been sighted. The town's entire fiscal life pegged to voyages still years from completion. Even the churches bore the marks of it, their pews sometimes funded by successful captains, their pulpits sometimes occupied by men who had themselves once stood a masthead watch before finding God in some other kind of infinite water. The economy that sustained all this did not run on the ships alone. It ran on 100 trades that fed the ships the way tributaries feed a river, each one specialized, each one essential, each one so interwoven with the others that to remove any single thread was to threaten the whole cloth. The cooperages stood thick with the smell of white oak and iron, their coopers bending staves into the casks that would eventually hold hundreds of barrels of oil, work requiring a precision that few landsmen appreciated, since a poorly made cask meant profit leaking away drop by drop across thousands of miles of ocean. The sail lofts occupied long, low buildings near the water, vast open floors where sailmakers cut and stitched canvas by the acre, their needles moving in rhythms as steady as heartbeats, producing the miles of sailcloth that would carry ships to the far Pacific and back. The chandleries held everything else a voyage required, and could not manufacture itself. Rope in every gauge, blocks and tackle, lanterns and oil for the lanterns that were not yet whale oil, salt for preserving meat, medicines against scurvy and fever, harpoons and lances forged by blacksmiths who took particular pride in the killing edge of their work. Knowing a dull iron might mean a whale lost and a season's earnings lost with it. Above all this labor sat the owners, men whose hands rarely touched rope or blubber, but whose signatures governed every voyage before it began. They were often Quakers in the Nantucket tradition, plain in dress and speech, austere in their personal habits, yet capable of calculating risk and return with a coldness that their religious modesty never quite concealed. They financed ships through complex arrangements of shares, spreading the enormous cost of outfitting a voyage across multiple investors so that no single loss could ruin any one man, a system that let them sleep soundly, regardless of what storms might find their vessels on the far side of the world. They lived in square, handsome houses, set back from the water on streets that grew progressively grander as a man's fleet grew, and they measured their success not in gallons of oil alone, but in reputation, in the confidence of other merchants, in daughters married well, and sons installed in the counting house to learn the trade from the safety of dry land. The men who actually sailed the ships these owners financed were almost without exception a different order of humanity entirely, though the trade needed both and could not have existed without the uneasy partnership between them. A captain might rise from before the mast himself, might have spent years learning the brutal mathematics of whale hunting from the bow of a whaleboat before ever standing on a quarterdeck. And this shared history meant something, even if the owner who employed him would never have consented to occupy the same social rooms. The captain bore the ship's soul in a way the owner never could, responsible not merely for oiling casks, but for the lives of every man aboard, for decisions made in fog and storm and the sudden chaos of a whale turned violent, decisions the owner would judge later from the comfort of his study without ever having felt the boat's timbers shudder beneath him. Beneath the captain stood the mates, men often only a voyage or two from commanding their own ships, ambitious and watchful, and beneath them, the specialized tradesmen essential to any working vessel, the cooper who would assemble the casks stowed disassembled in the hold, the blacksmith who could repair a broken harpoon at sea, the cook whose skill or incompetence shaped the mood of the entire crew far more than most captains cared to admit. And at the bottom, forming the great laboring mass of any crew, were the ordinary seamen and the green hands, the boys and men who had never been to sea at all, who would learn everything they knew of whaling in the doing of it, often at considerable cost to fingers, limbs, and occasionally lives. Filling these lower ranks was a business unto itself, and the town supported an entire apparatus devoted to the recruitment of bodies willing to sign away years of their lives for wages that amounted, in the end, to very little. Broadsides papered the walls of taverns and boarding houses in port cities up and down the coast, printed with woodcut images of leaping whales and words promising adventure, fortune, the chance to see the wide world, phrases calculated to appeal to boys who had never left their inland counties and men who had exhausted every other avenue of escape from debt or disappointment. Shipping agents, sometimes called crimps, in the less flattering corners of the trade's vocabulary, worked the boarding houses near the wharves, cultivating relationships with the keepers of these establishments so that a young man newly arrived in town, flush with the little money he possessed, might find himself steered gently but persistently toward the docks, toward a recruiter who spoke warmly of the fortunes to be made, and rather less warmly, if at all, about the lay system that would leave him owing money to the ship's owner rather than receiving any at voyage's end. The boarding houses themselves formed a kind of purgatory between the land life a man was leaving and the sea life he had not yet begun, cramped rooms holding bunks stacked close, the air thick with tobacco smoke, and the competing smells of unwashed wool and salt cod. Landladies who extended credit against future wages with the calm confidence of women who had seen 1,000 young men pass through and understood exactly how the arithmetic would resolve. Here, farm boys from Vermont and Ohio, restless in fields, their fathers expected them to till forever, met men who had already made the voyage once and returned with stories, some true, most embellished, all sufficient to plant the seed of departure in a mind already hungry for something larger than the horizon it had grown up watching. The crews that eventually walked down to the wharves and signed the ship's articles reflected a diversity that the rest of American society, still rigidly stratified by race and origin, rarely permitted elsewhere. Whaling ships took men where they found them, judged less by the color of a man's skin than by the strength of his back and his willingness to face a whale's flukes without flinching, and so the forecastles of these vessels held a mixture found almost nowhere else in the nation's working life. Free black sailors from New Bedford and beyond, some of them escaped from slavery and finding in the anonymity of a ship's crew a freedom the land could not offer them, worked alongside white farm boys and immigrant Portuguese from the Azores and Cape Verde. men whose islands had long supplied labor to American whaling fleets that stopped there routinely to resupply and recruit. Pacific Islanders, taken aboard during the long cruises through Polynesian waters, filled out crews further still, bringing their own knowledge of the sea and their own reasons, inscrutable to the American officers who commanded them, for choosing this particular form of exile. What drew all these men together, despite their differences of origin and circumstance, was some combination of desperation and dream that the whaling trade offered to satisfy both. For the farm boy, it was escape from a future already mapped in furrows and fences. For the freed man, it might be genuine opportunity, a chance to earn standing and money in a trade that cared more for competence than complexion, though this promise was often more generous in the telling than in the keeping. For the immigrant, it was passage to America itself, wages however meager, and the first rung of a ladder he hoped might lead somewhere better. For nearly all of them, it was the dream of the lay, that fractional share of the voyage's profit promised in the articles, a number that looked substantial when multiplied against the imagined riches of a ship's hold full of oil, though very few who signed their names that morning would ever see it amount to what they had allowed themselves to hope. And so the articles themselves waited on a table near the wharf, ink and paper, the only formality standing between a man's old life and the one he was about to enter, the terms already fixed by owners who understood the arithmetic far better than the young men now bending to sign, each signature a small, quiet transaction between ambition and uncertainty, made in the grey hour before the ship they were about to board had finished waiting alone in her fog. The table itself was nothing remarkable, a plank set on trestles outside the counting house, its surface scarred by years of ink and the pressure of hands that had signed before these. A clerk sat behind it with the ledger open, his fingers stained black at the tips, and beside him stood an agent of the ship's owners, a man whose coat was clean in a way that marked him apart from everyone else on the wharf. The young recruit who approached that morning was perhaps 17, perhaps 20. His hands, already rough from farm work or cooperage or whatever labor had failed to hold him, and he stood for a moment reading words he only half understood before the clerk turned the ledger toward him. He signed slowly, the pen unfamiliar in his grip, or if he could not write, he made his mark. An X pressed into the paper with the same solemnity another man might reserve for a wedding or a will. The agent watched without expression. He had seen 100 such signatures, would see 100 more before the season ended, and he understood that the boy before him was not thinking of numbers or shares or the long arithmetic of a voyage that had not yet begun. He was thinking, if he was thinking at all, of the ship herself, of her masts rising black against the pale sky, of the ocean he had perhaps never seen before arriving at this harbor, of the life he imagined might unfold once he stepped aboard her deck. The paper in front of him described none of that. It described instead a system of payment so particular to whaling that a man might spend 3 years at sea and still not fully grasp its mechanics until the voyage was over and the accounts were settled, often to his disappointment. This was the lay system, and it governed every whaling voyage of the age, a method of payment that replaced the fixed wage of ordinary merchant service with something closer to a gamble. Rather than earning a set sum for his labor, each man aboard was assigned a lay, a fractional share of the total profits from the voyage, calculated only after the oil was sold, every expense subtracted. A green hand, untested and unskilled, might be promised a lay of 1/200th or 1/150th, a fraction so small it seemed almost theoretical when spoken aloud on the dock, though the agent presented it with the confidence of a man offering fortune rather than uncertainty. The captain, by contrast, might claim a lay of 1/8 or 1/10, the mates somewhat less, the the boat steerers and coopers and blacksmiths arranged along a careful hierarchy of value, each man's worth to the voyage translated into a number that would determine, months or years later, whether he returned home with money in his pocket or owing more than when he left. The logic of the system served the owners well, for it bound every man's fortune to the success of the voyage without requiring the owners themselves to guarantee anything beyond a share of what the ship actually brought home. If the voyage failed, if the whales proved scarce, or the weather cruel, or the captain unlucky, the loss was distributed downward, felt most sharply by those who could least afford it. If the voyage succeeded, the larger shares still flowed upward toward the men who had risked capital rather than years of their lives. It was, in this sense, a quiet transfer of risk, dressed in the language of partnership, and the young men signing their names that morning rarely understood how thoroughly the arithmetic had been arranged against them before they ever set foot on deck. Nor did the lay represent the whole of what a green hand would owe by the time the ship returned. Long before departure, the outfitters of the port had already begun their own quiet accounting, advancing to each new recruit the clothing, the boots, the tobacco, the knife and needle and thread he would need for years at sea. All of it entered against his future earnings at prices considerably higher than a man might pay in an ordinary shop. A young man with no money to his name, and most who signed the articles had none, would leave port already indebted to men he had never properly met, his eventual lay diminished before the first whale had even been sighted. Some captains and owners profited further still by holding interest in the very outfitting shops that supplied their crews, so that the same voyage which promised a share of the profits also guaranteed, with far greater certainty, a share of the debt. It was not uncommon for a man to complete a 3-year voyage and find upon settling his account that he owed the owner's money rather than the reverse. The long labor of those years consumed entirely by advances he had taken before the anchor was ever raised. And yet men signed. They signed because the alternative, whatever it was, seemed to offer less, because the sea promised distance from debts already accumulated on land. Because a boy raised inland might imagine that 3 years away would return him transformed, moneyed, worldly, no longer the same uncertain figure who had walked onto the wharf that morning. The agents who recruited them understood this hunger and shaped their offers around it, speaking of famous voyages and lucky captains of holds filled to the beams with oil, of men who had sailed as green hands and returned with enough to buy land or marry well. They spoke less of the voyages that returned empty, of ships gone 2 years without a single whale, of captains whose crews deserted at the first foreign port rather than continue under their command. For among the sailors themselves, apart from whatever the agents claimed, there circulated a different kind of knowledge, passed quietly along the waterfront in the days before a ship's departure. Some captains were spoken of as lucky, their names attached to voyages that had filled the hold early and returned before the contracted years were fully spent, and a berth aboard such a ship was sought after, contested even by men who understood that fortune in this trade depended as much on the man giving orders as on the whales themselves. Captains carried a different reputation, whispered rather than spoken outright. Men known for empty holds or for tempers that made the long months at sea harder to bear than the work required. Men whose ships sat longer at the wharf before enough hands could be found to fill them. A young recruit signing the articles that morning would have done well to ask which kind of captain awaited him aboard the vessel he was about to join. Though many did not think to ask until they were already at sea, the question answered only by the slow accumulation of months without a sighting, or by the particular quality of silence that settled over a deck when the captain appeared. The dock itself, in the hours before departure, held its own quiet theatre of farewell, one repeated in every whaling port along the coast, with only small variations of dress and dialect. Wives stood apart from the general bustle, some holding infants who would not recognize their fathers upon return, others already carrying the child who would be born and partly raised before the ship came home again. Mothers embraced sons who had perhaps never left the county before, pressing into their hands small tokens, a Bible, a coin, a lock of hair, gestures meant to carry protection across a distance neither party could properly imagine. Children, too young to understand the length of the absence, waved simply because the adults around them waved, their farewells untroubled by the arithmetic of years that the grown men and women standing near them understood all too well. There was little weeping that was loud or public, for the whaling towns had long since made a practice of departure, and grief displayed too openly was considered, in some unspoken way, bad luck for the voyage itself. Instead, there were quiet words exchanged at the edge of the crowd, promises to write when a ship might be met at some foreign port, willing to carry letters home, instructions about money already owed or property to be minded, the practical business of absence folded into the last minutes before the gangway was drawn up. Some families would not see the man they embraced again for 3 years, and some, though none standing on the dock allowed themselves to dwell on this, would not see him again at all, the sea claiming what it would without regard for the shares promised in the ledger back at the counting house. The ship herself, through all of this, remained largely indifferent to the human weather playing out along her rail, her crew moving about the deck with the particular efficiency of men eager to be away, whatever sorrow lingered on the wharf behind them. Lines were cast off in sequence, the capstan turned, canvas rose slowly up the masts and caught what wind moved through the harbour, and the gap between hull and wharf began its slow widening, inches becoming, feet becoming, the first true distance of the voyage. Those left standing on the dock watched until the details of individual faces aboard the ship blurred into the general shape of the vessel, and then watched a while longer as that shape itself grew smaller against the grey water. The masts, the last visible thing before the hull dropped below the curve of the world, with all its debts and grief and unanswered questions, began at last to shrink behind them. Aboard the ship itself, the ocean did not care what had been left behind. It imposed, almost immediately, its own order on the men who now belonged to it, an order that had nothing to do with the town's clocks or its church bells or its ledgers of debt. The ship ran on the watch, a division of the day into 4-hour segments that repeated, without regard for sunrise or sunset, without regard for hunger or exhaustion, without regard for anything but the turning of the glass and the striking of the bell that marked its passing. A man came on deck at midnight and stood until 4 in the morning, watching the black water and the black sky and the small light of the binnacle lamp, and then he went below and slept until 8, and then he rose again, and the pattern continued, day folding into night, folding into day, until the distinction between them wore thin and eventually vanished altogether. The bell struck every half hour, a single note multiplying until it reached 8 strokes, and the watch changed, and a man could tell the time of day by counting those strokes as surely as he might once have read a clock face on a wall in the town he'd left. This was the first lesson of the sea, learned in the body before it was learned in the mind, that time aboard a ship was not a backdrop against which life happened, but a structure that shaped the life itself, an unyielding architecture of bells and watches that a man moved through whether he willed it or not. Below decks, in the forecastle where the green hands and ordinary seamen slept, the world was smaller than the smallest room any of them had known ashore. The space was cramped and low, so low that a tall man learned quickly to duck his head or pay the price in a cracked skull, and the bunks were built into the walls in tiers, narrow shelves of wood barely wide enough to hold a sleeping body, stacked one above another in the gloom. There was no true window, only what light came down through the scuttle when it was opened, and so the forecastle existed in a permanent dimness broken only by a swinging lantern that cast more shadow than illumination. The air itself carried a weight to it, thick, with the smell of tar used to seal the ship's seams, and beneath that, the salt tang of the sea that seemed to work its way into every fibre of rope and wood and cloth, till it became indistinguishable from the ship itself. There was the smell of salt pork, the staple of the sailor's diet, brined and packed in barrels and boiled until it lost whatever resemblance it once had to meat. And there was, beneath everything else, the smell of the bilge, that dark water that collected in the lowest part of the hull and could never quite be pumped dry, carrying with it the accumulated filth of the voyage. A smell that new men gagged against and old men no longer noticed at all. A man's berth was his only private space, a few feet of wood and canvas, and into it he crowded his sea chest, his few changes of clothing, whatever small comforts he had thought to bring, a Bible perhaps, or a miniature portrait, or a plug of tobacco saved for later. In this cramped dark, men slept in shifts as the watches demanded, so that the forecastle was never entirely still. Always someone rising, someone settling, someone's cough or muttered word breaking the silence, and a green hand learned to sleep through anything, or he did not sleep at all. Above this crowded world of common sailors rose the ship's hierarchy, as fixed and understood as the rigging itself, a structure that governed every relationship aboard from the moment the vessel cleared the harbor. At the top stood the captain, who occupied a solitude all his own, his cabin aft, his table set apart, his authority absolute and rarely questioned, for the law of the sea granted him a power that no civil authority ashore could match. He was reachable but distant, a man whose moods the whole ship learned to read, whose silence at breakfast might mean nothing, or might mean a storm was coming, or a whale had been sighted in a dream he half believed. Beneath him came the mates, first, second, sometimes third, each commanding his own boat when the whales were finally raised, each responsible for a portion of the ship's daily operation, the setting of sails, the keeping of the log, the discipline of the men assigned to his watch. The mates were men who had risen through years of service, who understood both the whale and the sea and the particular temperament of the men beneath them, and they carried themselves with the weight of that accumulated knowledge. Below the mates stood the boat steerers, men chosen for their skill with the harpoon and the oar, who would pull the whaleboat toward its quarry, and then, at the critical moment, drive the iron home, before yielding the steering oar to the mate who would finish the kill with the lance. Some ships called these men harpooners outright, and, whatever the title, they held a peculiar status aboard, neither officer nor common hand, respected for a skill that could not be taught quickly, and that the whole voyage's success depended upon. And at the bottom of this structure stood the green hands, the young men and boys who had never gone to sea before, who did not yet know the names of the ropes or the meaning of the mate's shouted orders, who scrubbed and hauled and fetched and endured the quiet scorn of the more experienced men until they had proven themselves capable of more. Between the green hands and the boat steerers stood the ordinary and able seamen, men who had made a voyage or two before and had learned enough to be trusted with real work, who occupied the middle ground of the ship's society, neither newly arrived nor yet elevated, and who often served as the quiet teachers of those beneath them, showing a green hand how to coil a line properly or how to eat salt pork without breaking a tooth on the brine-hardened rind. But the whale was not always there to be found, and for long stretches of the voyage, sometimes weeks at a time, the masthead lookout called down nothing but empty water, and the ship's labor turned instead to the endless maintenance that any wooden vessel demanded to survive the ocean's slow, patient assault upon it. Sails tore in wind and had to be mended, and men sat cross-legged on deck, with needle and palm working canvas with the same patience their mothers might have brought to a quilt, though the stitches here mattered more than any decoration, for a poorly mended sail could fail at the worst possible moment. Rigging had to be checked and retarred. Ropes spliced where it had begun to fray, the endless small repairs that kept a ship seaworthy, accumulating into a kind of permanent, unfinished labor that never truly concluded, only paused. And in the hours when even this work was done, when the sea was calm and the wind steady and nothing demanded a man's immediate attention, the sailors turned to scrimshaw, taking the teeth and bone of whales already caught, and, with knife and needle, working the ivory into intricate designs, ships and women and whales themselves. Paths stranded, in careful lines darkened with soot or ink rubbed into the scratches. This was patient work, requiring nothing but time, of which the voyage offered an abundance, and it produced objects that a man might carry home to a wife or sweetheart, small tokens of the months and years spent away, proof that the hands that made them had not been idle, even when the sea offered nothing to hunt. Alongside the scrimshaw came storytelling, the forecastle in the evening hours filling with voices, trading tales of other voyages, other captains, other whales that had nearly killed a man or made his fortune, and the stories grew with each telling, embellished and reshaped, until the line between what had happened and what had simply been said blurred into something the men understood was not quite true, and not quite false either, but simply theirs, the shared property of the ship's long idle hours. For idle the hours often were, in a way that few men who had not gone to sea could fully understand beforehand. The ocean stretched in every direction, identical from one horizon to the next, and a ship might sail for a week or 2 weeks or more without sighting another vessel, without sighting land, without any change to the vast blue circle in which it seemed to sit motionless despite the wind in its sails and the wake trailing behind it. This silence pressed upon a man in ways that the noise and crowding of the town never had. There was no bell ringing to announce a delivery, no voice calling from a neighboring house, no dog barking in the street. There was only the wind and the water and the creak of the ship's own timbers, and a man learned to live inside that silence, to find within it whatever peace or dread his own temperament supplied. The days blurred one into another during these long stretches, marked only by the changing of the watch and the position of the sun, until a man might lose track of how many weeks had passed since the last whale, how many since the last landfall, how many since he had last heard a voice that did not belong to this same crew. He now knew better than he had ever known his own family. And in this blurring, something shifted in how time itself was understood aboard the ship, a change that came upon each man gradually and without his quite noticing until it had already happened. Ashore, time had been marked by seasons, by the turning of a calendar, by the specific date on which a debt came due or a child was born. At sea, time became instead a rhythm, cyclical rather than linear, the watches repeating endlessly, the bells striking the same pattern day after day, regardless of what waited beyond the ship's rail. A man began to measure his life, not in months, but in voyages, not in weeks, but in watches, stood and watches slept through, and the particular date, the actual number that would have meant something ashore, faded into an abstraction that mattered only for the log the captain kept in his cabin. This was neither wholly a loss nor wholly a gift, but simply the shape that time assumed at sea, untethered from the land's insistence on progress and arrival, existing instead in the perpetual present of wind and water and the next 4 hours of watch, stretching on toward whatever the masthead lookout might eventually cry down, or might not. For weeks yet to come. The ship's course, could one have traced it from above with the patience of a gull riding the trade winds, would have shown a long curve southward down the length of the Atlantic, following the coast of the Americas at a wide and prudent distance before bending east and then south again toward the bottom of the world, where two oceans met in a place that sailors spoke of the way men speak of a debt long owed, and finally come due. Some ships bound for the Pacific grounds took this route around Cape Horn, threading the passage between the tip of South America and the scattered, wind-scoured islands that mark the edge of the known and habitable Earth. Others, bound for different waters, chose instead the long reach around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern point of Africa, where the Atlantic gave way to the Indian Ocean in currents that had drowned enough ships to fill a small nation's graveyards. Either route asked the same question of a vessel and her crew, which was whether they had been built and trained well enough to survive weather that seemed to hold no memory of gentler days. The captain's private charts, kept in a chest in his cabin, and consulted with the wary respect one gives to something that can be wrong in ways that kill, showed these capes not as clean lines, but as clusters of soundings and warnings, the accumulated caution of generations of men who had gone before, had not returned to update the charts themselves. He would emerge from his cabin in the days before the crossing with a graver look than usual, and the mates would notice, and the word would pass forward without needing to be spoken aloud. The Horn soon, or the Cape soon, and the ship would seem to draw a breath before the labor began. The storms near these capes did not announce themselves as storms elsewhere might, with a darkening sky and a slow build that gave a crew time to prepare. Here, the weather seemed to exist in a state of near-perpetual violence, punctuated by intervals of merely difficult conditions that men came with the strange adaptability of those who have no choice to regard as rest. The waves at the Horn rose to heights that made the ship's masts seem suddenly modest, seem almost apologetic in their reach toward a sky that offered no shelter and little light. A man at the wheel in such seas held on not merely to steer, but to remain aboard, watching the horizon tilt and vanish and reappear at impossible angles, the ship's bow burying itself in water that came aboard in sheets and then in solid weight. The pumps worked without cease by men whose hands had long since stopped registering the cold as pain and had begun to register it more distantly as a kind of absence. The sails in such weather were reduced to the barest scraps that could still give the ship steerage, and even these scraps of canvas, no larger sometimes than a tablecloth, strained against their sheets with a violence that could tear a man's grip loose if he was fool enough to trust his strength against the winds. Reefing topsails in a Cape Horn gale was work done by men lying flat along the yard, wrapped around it with arms and legs both, in wind that tried to peel them off like fruit from a branch, in cold that turned wet canvas to something closer to sheet iron, in darkness that made every motion a matter of memory and touch rather than sight. Below, water found its way through seams that had held tight in gentler seas, and the crew slept. When they slept, in bedding that was no longer meaningfully dry, in a ship that groaned and complained through her frame, the way an old man complains through his joints. It was during these crossings, when the ship's position could not be reckoned by any glimpse of familiar coastline, that the crew came to understand the peculiar art by which their vessel found her way across an ocean that offered no landmarks, no signs, nothing but the identical repetition of water in every direction. The captain and his mates, navigated by two methods, held together in an uneasy partnership, the one ancient and the other only somewhat less so. There was the observation of the stars and sun, taken with a sextant at noon and at other appointed hours, the instrument's small mirrors and scales translating the angle of a celestial body above the horizon into a line of position that, combined with others, might fix the ship's location within some reasonable margin of the truth. This work required a clear sky, which the Great Capes were not always generous enough to provide, and so there were long stretches when the sky remained shrouded and the sextant sat useless in its case, a fine instrument rendered decorative by weather. In such times, the ship's position was reckoned instead by dead reckoning, a method both older and humbler, wherein the mate or captain calculated the ship's presumed location by keeping careful account of her speed, logged by throwing overboard a wooden float on a line marked with knots, and counting how many passed through a sailor's hands in a measured span of sand through a glass, combined with her heading, read from the compass, and the hours elapsed since the last known position. This was an exercise in accumulated estimation, each hour's guess built upon the last, so that small errors compounded across days into larger ones, and a ship's true position might differ from her reckoned one by a distance that, in poor visibility near a rocky coast, could mean the difference between safe passage and disaster. The captain kept these calculations in a log that he alone fully understood, penciled figures and crossed out attempts, a private mathematics of survival that he shared with his officers only so much as duty required, and with the crew not at all, for the men before the mast had no need of knowing precisely where they were, only that someone did, or believed he did, or was doing his best to approximate a belief. Between these great labors of rounding the capes, the ship's long voyage was punctuated by calls at certain islands and ports that served as way stations for whaling vessels making their passage to distant grounds. The Azores, rising green and volcanic from the mid-Atlantic, offered fresh water, vegetables, and sometimes new hands willing to sign on for a share of the voyage's proceeds, young men from the Portuguese islands who would prove in time to make up no small portion of the whaling fleet's crews. Further south, the Cape Verde Islands offered similar respite, a chance to fill the water casks that had grown brackish and low, to purchase what fresh provisions the barren islands could supply, to walk on ground that did not pitch and roll beneath the feet, if only for the brief hours that business ashore required. Pacific Islands, once the ship had rounded her cape and entered the ocean that would occupy the greater portion of her voyage, offered further such calls, places whose names would become as familiar to a whaling crew as any port back home, though the welcome they offered varied according to the temper of the islanders and the conduct, often less than exemplary, of the sailors who had called there before. These brief stops ashore were treasured out of proportion to their actual length. A day or two, perhaps 3, in which a man might eat food that had not come from a cask, might drink water that did not taste of the barrel that held it, might feel earth beneath boots that had grown accustomed to nothing but a moving deck. The captain permitted such liberty as he judged safe, mindful always that a crew given too much freedom in port might not return to the ship in full number, and that desertion, though understood, could not be so encouraged as to threaten the voyage's completion. So liberty was granted in watches, some men ashore while others remained aboard, and the ship was provisioned as quickly as business allowed. And then the anchor was raised again, and the island fell astern, and the ocean resumed its long insistence on emptiness. Upon the ocean itself, in the vast stretches between such islands, the ship was not always so alone as her isolation might suggest. Whaling grounds drew whaling vessels the way good pasture draws grazing herds, and it was not uncommon, in certain seasons and certain waters, for one ship to raise the sails of another on the horizon, and for the two captains, if the wind and their inclinations allowed, to bring their vessels within hailing distance and exchange the particular courtesy that whalemen extended to one another, regardless of their home port or flag. This exchange, called a gam by those who practiced it, was no small event in the slow procession of a voyage's days. Boats were lowered, and men rowed across water that separated two small worlds that had each been sealed unto themselves for months. And for some hours, sometimes for the better part of a day, sailors traded news of home, mail that one ship had carried and might now pass to another bound in the opposite direction. Rumors of where the whales had lately been sighted in numbers worth pursuing, word of ships lost or ships lucky, gossip of captains known to both crews by reputation if not by direct acquaintance. Such meetings were savored with a hunger that had little to do with the actual substance of what was exchanged. for the letters were often stale by the time they changed hands, and the whale sightings might already be old news. The animals moved on to other waters entirely. What mattered was the human contact itself, the proof that the ocean, however wide and however empty it might present itself in the ordinary run of days, still contained other men living lives that echoed one's own, other ships pursuing the same quarry under the same vast and indifferent sky. When the gam ended and the boats returned to their respective vessels, and the two ships parted on their separate courses, the isolation that resumed felt, for a time, heavier for having been briefly lifted. For it was isolation in the end that defined these long crossings more than any storm or any port. Isolation that deepened not suddenly but by degrees, so gradually that a man might not notice how far he had traveled into it until he tried, one evening, to recall the sound of a particular voice from home or the color of a particular door, and found the memory had gone soft and uncertain at its edges, worn down by the sameness of days that offered nothing to sharpen it against. Weeks passed without the sight of land, without the sight of any vessel but their own, the horizon a perfect and unbroken circle of water meeting sky in every direction, and the men aboard settled into a kind of patient endurance that was neither despair nor contentment, but something adjacent to both. A state peculiar to those who have given themselves over entirely to a voyage whose end lies somewhere beyond calculation, waiting only for the cry that would eventually come down from the masthead and give the emptiness its purpose. High above the deck, where the mainmast tapered into open air and the ship's motion translated into a slow, wide arc against the sky, a man stood watch with his forearms hooked over the hoops of the crow's nest, his eyes moving in patient sweeps across the water. This was the lookout, and his task was among the loneliest and most essential aboard the vessel, to see, before anyone else could see, the thing the entire voyage had been built to find. He stood his watch in 2-hour turns, sometimes longer when the weather allowed it, and the captain's patience for delay had worn thin, and in that time he learned to read the ocean's surface the way a man might read the face of someone he had known for years, noting every small deviation from what he expected. Every ripple that did not belong to wind or current. The work asked for a particular kind of attention, not the sharp vigilance of danger, but a soft, sustained looking that could be held for hours without fraying. The eyes were trained to catch not shapes, but suggestions. A change in the color of the water, a stillness where there ought to have been motion, and above all, the faint white ghost of a spout, rising and dispersing against the horizon before a man could be entirely sure he had seen it at all. Whales did not announce themselves boldly from a distance. They surfaced according to their own unhurried rhythm, exhaling in soft plumes that vanished as quickly as they appeared, and a lookout who blinked at the wrong moment might miss the only sign he would get for another hour. The good ones learned not to trust their first glance, but to hold their gaze a moment longer, to let the sea confirm or deny what the eye had almost seen. In the coldest latitudes, the wind at that height cut through wool and oilskin alike, and the mast itself seemed to sway with a wider and more nauseating motion than anything felt on deck, so that new hands sent aloft for their first watch often came down pale and unsteady. In warmer waters, the sun beat down without the relief of shade, and the glare off the water after long hours could leave a man's eyes aching and reluctant to focus by the time his relief climbed up to take the watch from him. Whatever the climate, the work demanded a stillness of mind that most other duties aboard the ship did not require, a willingness to let hours pass in near total quiet, punctuated only by the creak of rigging and the distant complaints of gulls, while the eyes kept their unbroken vigil over a sea that gave nothing away easily. And then, on a morning that had begun like 100 others, indistinguishable in its grey light and its patient monotony, the lookout's voice would break the stillness with a cry that seemed to travel through the ship's very timbers before it reached the ears of the men below. "There she blows," 3 words, called down from the masthead in a tone that carried both certainty and urgency, and in the space of a breath the entire temperament of the vessel would change. Men who had been moving through their duties with the slow deliberation of those expecting nothing new, set down their tools without finishing the motion they had begun. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the ship itself, in the small imaginings of men long at sea, seemed to lean forward at the sound, as if she too had been waiting for permission to come alive. The mate would call up for a bearing, and the lookout, steadying himself against the mast, would point with his whole arm extended toward the place where the spout had risen, tracking its drift as the animal moved beneath the surface and reappeared to breathe again, giving the men below a rhythm to follow, there and there again, closer now sounding. And there, once more, the captain, summoned from his cabin or from wherever the ship's business had occupied him, would climb part way into the rigging himself to see with his own eyes what kind of whale it was and how many there might be. For a single spout often meant a solitary bull moving alone through open water, while several spouts scattered across a wider area suggested a pod, and the difference mattered enormously to what came next. The order to lower the boats came quickly once the whale's position and behavior had been judged worth the risk, and the deck that had been quiet only minutes before erupted into a controlled, practiced chaos that had been drilled into the crew since the voyage's earliest days. Boat crews scrambled to their stations, each man moving to a role assigned to him weeks before, and rehearsed until it required no thought, the boat header taking his place at the steering oar, the harpooner checking the lashing of his irons one final time. Pock! The oarsmen settling onto their thwarts and testing the give of the water beneath their blades before the boat had even left the falls. The whaleboats themselves, slender things of cedar planking, built for speed and lightness rather than comfort, were swung out from the davits and lowered with a controlled drop that brought them to the water's surface in a matter of seconds. The falls released the instant the hull kissed the waves so that the boat could pull clear of the ship before the swell brought them crashing back against her side. Once free of the ship, the boats moved with a different kind of urgency than anything the men had known aboard the larger vessel. The oars bit into the water in long, disciplined strokes, and the boat header's voice, kept low so as not to carry across the surface and startle the whale, called the rhythm that would bring them within striking distance. There was a peculiar tension in this pursuit that came not from speed alone, but from restraint. For a whale could sense the disturbance of oars poorly handled, or the vibration of a hull moving too aggressively through the water, and a chase mismanaged. And so the men rowed with a controlled power, their breathing steady, their eyes fixed on the boat header or on the water ahead, where the whale's dark shape might surface again. The only sounds, the rhythmic dip and pull of the oars and the soft slap of waves against the boat's thin cedar hull. A sound so much smaller and more intimate than anything heard aboard the ship, that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. In these final minutes before the strike, the whale itself became, to the men bent over their oars, something more than a target. It was, more often than not, an animal of extraordinary size, capable of pulling the entire boat and its crew across the surface of the ocean at a speed no man could achieve by his own effort, its body carrying a mass that dwarfed the vessel sent to hunt it many times over. Sperm whales, the great object of so many of these voyages, might stretch longer than the whaleboat itself several times over, their heads alone accounting for a third of their enormous length, their skin scarred in places from decades of encounters with squid in the deep water below where no man could follow, often stretching back further than the years of any man aboard the ship that pursued them. There was something in this disparity of scale and age that gave the whale a presence the men rarely spoke of directly, but clearly felt. An old and settled dignity that belonged to a creature who had lived through decades of ocean. End. Surfacing now only briefly into a world of men and iron before returning to depths that remained, and would always remain, entirely beyond human reach. The harpooner, standing braced in the bow with his iron raised, waited for the boatheader's final word before driving the weapon into the animal's flank, and in that instant the whale's vast strength became suddenly, violently present, the boat lurching forward as line ran out from the tub at a speed that could scorch a careless hand. The whale sounding or running in a burst of power that reminded every man aboard, however many times they had witnessed it, that they had attached themselves by a length of hemp to a creature whose full strength they had barely glimpsed. What followed was neither battle in the way the word was often used ashore, nor simple slaughter, but something stranger and more sustained. An extended contest between the whale's raw power and the whaleman's accumulated skill, fought out across the ocean's surface until one or the other yielded, the whale through exhaustion and loss of blood, the men through nothing but the patient application of everything they had trained to do. It was difficult, even for men long hardened to the work, to entirely separate the necessity of the hunt from a quiet awareness of what it meant to take the life of something so old, so massive, so foreign in its intelligence and its patience with the sea. Few among the crew spoke of this awareness aloud, for the language of the trade did not easily accommodate such reflection, and the economic pressures of the voyage left little room for hesitation once the chase had begun. And yet, something of that intimacy remained unspoken in the way men described a particularly large whale years afterward, in the careful attention paid to an animal's movements during the chase, in the respect, however, buried beneath the practical language of barrels and oil, that passed between hunter and hunted in those final charged minutes before the strike. It was a strange bond, forged not through affection, but through proximity, through the shared violence of an encounter that asked everything of both creatures involved. And it would remain, long after the voyage ended, one of the truths the men carried home with them that could not easily be spoken of on land. Where no one waiting at the harbour could quite understand what it meant to have rowed silently across open water towards something so large, so old, and so entirely unaware, until the moment the iron struck home, that its presence had already been marked from far above by a single voice calling down from the masthead into a ship that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this, the boat that had been lowered so carefully, so silently, in the last long minutes of the chase, now became something else entirely the instant the harpooner rose from his thwart and drove the iron home. There was no time in that instant for reflection. The whale's body, which had seemed a moment before like some drifting island indifferent to the small craft approaching it, convulsed with a force that seemed to come from the sea itself, rather than from any single creature. The water broke white around the flukes. The boat rocked hard, and every man aboard felt in his own body the shock that had just been delivered to the animals, though none would have called it that in the moment. There was only the line uncoiling from its tub with a hiss that the men had heard described 100 times before they ever felt it themselves, and always found the descriptions inadequate. It ran out fast, faster than seemed possible for something that had been so still, so neatly coiled, only seconds earlier. The boat steerer's hands moved with practiced speed, guiding the line around the loggerhead at the boat's stern, not to stop it, but to control it, to let it burn through the wood in a way that gave the boat some claim over what was about to happen, though everyone aboard understood that the claim was thin and could be lost in an instant if the line snagged. If a coil caught a man's ankle or wrist, if the wood of the loggerhead failed to hold. Whaling men had died in exactly that way, taken under before anyone could reach for a knife, and every man in the boat knew it, though none spoke of it now. There was no time for speaking of anything except the necessary words, shouted short and sharp over the noise of water and rope and their own breathing. Then the boat began to move. It went slowly at first, a heavy dragging motion as the whale, wounded and startled, began to pull away from the source of its pain with the vast, unthinking strength of a creature that had never before encountered anything capable of holding it. The boat's bow lifted, and the men adjusted their weight instinctively, some bracing against the gunwales, others gripping the thwarts, and within a few more seconds the slow drag became something closer to flight. The whaling men called it a Nantucket sleigh ride, a phrase that had softened over the years into something almost playful, though there was nothing playful in the experience itself. The boat cut through the water at a speed no set of oars could have produced, spray coming up over the bow in sheets that soaked the men through in an instant, salt stinging their eyes, their mouths running down collars already damp with the sweat of the earlier chase. The wind of their own passage roared past their ears, mixing with the officer's voice as he called out, "Adjustments, watch the line, hold steady, trim her, keep her head up." Each command clipped and immediate, meant to be obeyed without the delay of thought. There was no leisure in this. Every man's arms ached from the earlier rowing, and now ached further from the tension of bracing against the speed they could not control, muscles locked rigid in postures that would leave them sore for days afterward, though none would have time to notice that until much later, once the whale was theirs or lost, once the danger had passed one way or another. The whale's path was not straight. It turned, sometimes sharply, and the boat turned with it, sometimes nearly capsizing as the men leaned hard against the pull, using their weight as counterbalance in a coordination that had been practiced and drilled precisely because there was no time, in the moment itself, to plan such things freshly. The officer at the steering oar worked constantly, correcting, anticipating, his eyes fixed on the humped shape ahead of them that surfaced and dove, drawing them onward across water that had, only minutes before, seemed calm enough to hold a whale unaware. Now it seemed to hold nothing but motion, spray, and the taut singing line that connected the small boat to the animal's enormous wounded body. This could not last. No creature, however large, however strong, could sustain such an effort indefinitely, and the men in the boat knew this even as their arms burned and their soaked clothes clung to them and the spray continued to strike their faces with each surge forward. The whale's dives grew shorter. Its surges lost some of their earlier violence. The line, when it went briefly slack, was hauled in swiftly by hands that had been waiting for exactly that opportunity, coiling it back into the tub with quick, economical movements, gaining distance on the animal a few feet at a time until the boat drew close enough again for the boat steerer and the officer to exchange places. The officer taking up the lance now, the harpooner moving to the steering oar. A careful exchange of positions performed in a rocking boat beside an animal capable, even in exhaustion, of destroying them all with a single unlucky movement of its flukes. The lance was a different instrument from the harpoon, meant not to hold, but to kill, and the throw or thrust that delivered it required a precision that came only from repetition, from having done this before, from understanding exactly where beneath the water's surface the whale's vital organs lay hidden. The boat came alongside, dangerously close now, close enough that the whale's great eye, when it rolled to regard them, seemed to hold something the men did not like to name, though several among them, in later years, admitted to having seen it and been unsettled by it. The lance went in, was worked with careful strokes, meant to reach the lungs, and then was withdrawn, the boat pulling back sharply to avoid what came next, which the whalemen knew by the grim, practical name of the flurry. The whale's final effort was not calm. It thrashed, spouted water, mixed now with dark blood, described in the old accounts as the chimney afire, though there was nothing of celebration in the phrase, as the men who used it understood it. The sea around the animal churned red and white together, and the boat kept its distance, oars ready, every man watching for the moment when this last violent effort would end. It always did end, though the length of that ending varied, sometimes brief, sometimes prolonged, in a way that made the watching harder rather than easier, and when it ended completely. The great body rolled, settled, and went still, floating heavy and enormous on water that only minutes before had carried it running at a speed no boat alone could match. The quiet that followed was its own kind of event. The men, breathing hard, salt-crusted arms, trembling with the accumulated strain of the chase and the ride and the kill, sat for a moment in a stillness that felt strange after the chaos preceding it. The sea, still slightly disturbed by the whale's final thrashing, began to smooth again, the waves settling back into their ordinary rhythm as though nothing unusual had occurred, though the great dark shape now floating low in the water was evidence enough that something had. The other boats, which had followed at whatever distance the chase allowed, began to gather, oars dipping in more measured strokes now, no longer racing, but approaching with the careful attention required to secure a carcass of such size to the boats without capsizing under its weight or the weight of the water it displaced. There was no cheering, whatever the popular imagination of such moments might have supplied. The men who did this work understood too well what it had cost, both to the whale and to themselves, and how easily the outcome might have gone otherwise. Whaling logs and the memories of men who lived to write them down are full of the other outcomes: the boats staved by a fluke strike, the men thrown into cold water and lost before help could reach them, arms and legs broken or torn away in accidents that happened too fast for anyone to prevent. The lines that took a man under before his mates could cut him free. Every successful hunt carried within it the memory, spoken or not, of every hunt that had not ended in success, and every crew knew someone or knew of someone who had not come back from a chase very much like the one they had just completed. It was this knowledge more than any triumph that produced the quiet mood among the men as they made the whale fast alongside the boats for the long tow back to the ship. There was work still ahead, and it would occupy them for the better part of the coming day and night. But for this brief interval floating on a sea gone calm again, beside the vast still shape of the animal they had killed, something like reverence moved among them, unspoken, unacknowledged in any log or letter home, ditch on in the way a man might rest his hand briefly on the whale's rough hide, as though in acknowledgement of what had just passed between them, before turning back to the ropes, and the work of bringing their prize home to a ship that had, from the very beginning, been waiting for exactly this. The towing began in earnest once the brief stillness had passed, and it was work that tested the body in ways the chase itself had not. But Dic Tantis, the whale, larger now in death than it had ever seemed alive, resisted the water with the dumb weight of something that no longer cared to move. The men set their oars and pulled, and the boat crept forward by degrees so small that only the widening gap of foam behind them gave any proof of progress at all. An hour might pass in this way, then another, the ship a fixed point on the horizon that seemed reluctant to grow any nearer, and the men said little, because there was little to say, and because breath itself had become a resource to be spent carefully, like fresh water in a drought. Sometimes a second boat came alongside to add its strength to the tow line, and the two crews worked in a silence, broken only by the creak of the oars and the low grunt that each man gave at the top of his stroke, a sound as old as labor itself, unchanged by whatever century or ocean it happened to occur in. When at last the ship grew large enough to make out the individual figures waiting at her rail, a kind of second wind came over the rowers, not from any lessening of fatigue, but from the simple nearness of rest, and they closed the final distance with a will that surprised even themselves. The whale was brought alongside and made fast with heavy chains, looped about the flukes and through holes cut near the head, lashed to the ship's hull, so that the great body lay in the water like a dark continent run aground against her side. Blood still seeping from it in threads that the sea took and thinned and carried away. The ship, which had ridden high and eager at anchor for so many months, now took on a new posture, listing slightly toward the weight lashed to her flank, and something in her design that had always anticipated this moment finally found its purpose, for she had been built not merely to sail, but to receive exactly this burden, to become, for the length of the voyage's remainder, half vessel and half slaughterhouse. The cutting-in began without much ceremony. A stage was rigged over the side, a narrow plank suspended on ropes just above the waterline, and upon it the mates took their places with long-handled spades ground sharp as razors, for a dull blade in this work was worse than useless. It was dangerous, liable to slip and take a man's leg rather than the whale's flesh. The first cut was made just behind the head, a deep incision through blubber, the color of old ivory, and from that opening the real labor commenced, the stripping of the skin and fat in one continuous spiraling sheet, called the blanket piece, drawn upward by a great hook and tackle rigged from the mainmast, so that as the strip was cut free below, it was hauled aloft above, and the whale's body itself began to rotate in the water under the tension, turning slowly, ponderously, like something enormous, and asleep being coaxed to wake. The men on the cutting stage worked with a rhythm that had clearly been learned through repetition rather than instruction, each aware of where the other's blades moved, none wishing to be the one whose carelessness opened a gash in a shipmate's arm rather than in the whale's hide. The sound of it was unlike anything else aboard ship, a wet, tearing hiss as the blubber parted, punctuated by the creak of the tackle and the occasional sharp command from the mate overseeing the stage, his voice pitched to carry over the general clamor without rising to a shout, for shouting wasted breath that the work itself required. The blanket piece, once freed to a manageable length, was cut through and lowered into the blubber room below decks, where other hands waited to reduce it further, slicing the great slab into smaller pieces called horse pieces, and these again into thinner slices called Bible leaves, for the way they seemed to fan open like the pages of some vast and greasy scripture, all of it done to increase the surface area that would render more quickly once it reached the fire. This continued for hours, the whale rotating, the blanket unwinding from it in an endless ribbon, until at last the great skull was reached and separated, and what remained of the carcass, stripped now of the fat that had made it valuable, was cut loose and left to the sea, where it did not sink at once but drifted, pale and diminished, drawing gulls and sometimes sharks, before it slipped finally beneath the surface and out of the story altogether. By this point, the tryworks had already been lit, the brick furnace built into the deck itself, incongruous in its permanence aboard a vessel, otherwise given over entirely to motion and change. Beneath its great iron pots, fires were kindled with wood at first, and then, once enough blubber had been rendered to produce it, with the dried fritters of already boiled fat, called scraps, which burned with a fierce and oily flame that required no further fuel from the ship's dwindling stores. The smoke that rose from this fire was thick and black, rolling off the deck in a column that could be seen for miles under the right conditions, staining the sails a faint grey if the wind held steady from an unfortunate quarter, and settling into the very seams of the ship, into the men's clothing, into their hair and skin, until the smell of it became less something they noticed than something they simply were, a smell that would follow them home and linger, they were told by older hands, for weeks after the voyage's end, no matter how thoroughly they scrubbed. The Bible leaves of blubber were fed into the trypots in batches, and there they boiled and reduced, releasing the oil while the solid matter that remained now called cracklings or scraps, was skimmed off and used, as noted, to feed the very fire that had cooked it, a closed and efficient cruelty that wasted nothing. The oil itself, once rendered, was ladled into a cooling tank, and from there, once sufficiently reduced in temperature to be handled without ruining the wood, decanted into casks that had been made ready in the hold weeks or months before, coopered tight against leakage, stamped or marked according to whatever system the ship's officers kept for tallying the voyage's yield. The smell of the boiling oil was acrid and pervasive, not entirely unpleasant to men who had grown used to it, though newer hands were known to lose whatever was in their stomachs during their first encounter with it. A rite of passage endured privately at the rail and rarely spoken of afterward. This work did not observe the ordinary boundaries of day and night. Once cutting in had begun, the whale could not be left half-processed, for the meat and fat would spoil, drawing sharks in numbers that made further work dangerous, and so the crew divided itself into shifts that carried the labor through the darkness as steadily as through daylight, the tryworks fire providing the only illumination on deck to a great flickering glow that lit the underside of the sails and threw enormous shifting shadows of the working men across the rigging, so that from a distance, had there been anyone to see it, the ship might have appeared to be burning, some slow, controlled conflagration adrift upon black water. Men slept in snatches when their shift ended, falling into their berths still smeared with oil and soot, waking a few hours later to relieve their shipmates and take up the spades and the ladles again, the whole process governed, not by the clock, but by the whale itself, by how much of it remained to be reduced. And it might take the better part of a full day and night, sometimes longer for the largest animals, before the last of the blubber had gone into the pots and the decks could finally be scrubbed of the grease and blood that had accumulated across every surface. It was, despite its brutality, or perhaps because of it, a labor that drew the crew together in a manner that little else aboard ship could manage. The hierarchy of the vessel did not dissolve during these hours. The mate still directed, and the captain still oversaw, but the shared exhaustion, the shared stench, the shared ache of hands that had gripped spade handles or ladled oil for hour upon hour produced a rough equality of suffering that cut across rank in small, boardless ways, an officer passing a flask to a green hand without being asked, a boy given a moment's respite that no strict accounting of duty required, the collective sigh of relief when the last of the oil was finally decanted, and the fires allowed to die down, shared equally by every man on deck, regardless of his place in the ship's articles. It was, some said afterward, the truest fellowship the voyage produced, forged not in the drama of the chase, but in the long grinding tedium of the render, when there was nothing left to prove, and only the work itself to get through. Below decks, the casks accumulated with a slowness that mirrored the whole shape of the voyage, one whale, then another, then a long stretch of empty weeks before a third, each success marked not by celebration, but by the quiet arithmetic of the hold, filling by degrees. And the ship, as month gave way to month, began to ride perceptibly lower in the water, her draft deepening in a way that any sailor aboard could read as plainly as a calendar, a slow subsidence that told the story of the hunt more honestly than any log entry, until at last, far off in a future none of them could yet see, she would sit, heavy and full, and ready to turn her bow at last toward home. Between the whales, there was only the sea, and the sea, unlike the hunt, asked nothing of a man but patience. Weeks folded into other weeks. A month might pass with nothing on the horizon but the same grey line dividing water from sky, and then another month after that, until the calendar kept below decks became a kind of fiction, a thing the mind consulted out of habit rather than belief. Whalemen spoke of these stretches not as boredom exactly, though boredom was there, thick and constant, but as a peculiar suspension, as though the ship herself were holding her breath, and the men aboard her had no choice but to hold theirs alongside her. Some voyages recorded 4 months, 5, between one whale taken and the next the ocean offering nothing but its own vast indifference. Mile upon mile of water that seemed, to the watch pacing the deck at night, entirely undisturbed by the presence of the hunters drifting across it. It was in these long, empty intervals that the character of a ship's company revealed itself most clearly, for a crew could be brave in the moment of the chase and still come apart, slowly in the tedium that surrounded it. The masters of whaling vessels understood this, so the idle hours were rarely left entirely idle. There was always mending to do, rigging to splice, barrels to inspect for rot, the endless small maintenance that kept a wooden ship from succumbing to salt and time. But even with the ship's work parceled out, there remained hours after hours in which a man was left alone with his own thoughts, and it was here that the crew found, each in his own way, some means of enduring. Scrimshaw was among the gentlest of these means, and perhaps the most enduring, for pieces made in those quiet hours still exist in drawers and museum cases long after the men who carved them have been forgotten. A sailor with a whale's tooth, a sliver of bone, and a sail needle for an engraving tool could pass an entire afternoon in careful, patient work, scratching the outline of a ship, a whale, a woman's face remembered or imagined, a home port he had not seen in a year. Lamp black rubbed into the fine lines gave the etching definition, and the tooth, once blank, became something else entirely, a record of longing pressed into hard, permanent material, as if the carver hoped that what he could not say aloud might survive better carved than spoken. Some men carved corset busks for wives or sweethearts, delicate strips of bone meant to stiffen a garment, engraved with hearts, ships, initials, small tokens of a domestic life that felt, from the middle of an empty ocean, impossibly distant. Others turned to their journals, and the words they left behind carry a different kind of weight than the log itself, which recorded latitude and longitude and barrels struck, dry and official. A personal journal permitted a man to write what the log would not hold: the ache of missing a wife's voice, the strange beauty of phosphorescence trailing off the hull at night, a private complaint against an officer he dared not speak aloud. These journals were often plain, unpolished things, spelling uncertain, grammar loose, but they carry an honesty that official records rarely achieve, because they were never meant for other eyes. A man might write only a line some days. Weather fair, nothing sighted, feeling low, and in that brevity there is more of the isolation than any lengthy passage could convey. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done and the watch had been set, there were hymns. Whaling crews were not uniformly religious, but hymn singing served a purpose beyond faith. It was communal, it was ordered, it gave shape to an hour that might otherwise dissolve into restless silence. A few voices raised together in the forecastle, uneven, unpracticed, carried a comfort that had little to do with the words and everything to do with the simple fact of shared sound, proof that a man was not alone even in the middle of nowhere, that other lungs breathed the same air and other throats made the same effort at melody. Card games served a similar function, though the captain often watched them warily, for cards could turn from pastime to grievance when wagers ran ahead of a man's wages, and disputes over debts owed against a share not yet earned could fester for the length of a voyage. For, despite the songs and the carving and the careful rationing of the hours, isolation wore on men, and it wore on them unevenly. Homesickness was the most universal complaint, though it was rarely named so plainly in the log. It showed itself instead in irritability, in men who grew short with one another over trifles, in silences that stretched too long at the mess table. Tensions between crewmen, some of whom had never met before signing the articles and came from different ports, different languages, different tempers, could simmer for months before boiling over into a shouting match on deck or a fight quickly broken up by an officer's fist or a rope's end. Discipline aboard a whaler was the captain's to administer, and most captains preferred to keep it light. For a flogged man was a resentful man, and resentment aboard a ship with nowhere to send it could curdle into something more dangerous. There are accounts scattered through the records of the era of murmurs that edged toward mutiny, not the dramatic uprisings of legend, but quieter things, a refusal to lower the boats, a knot of men gathered too long in low conversation, a captain who found it prudent to double the officer's watch for a week until the mood passed. Most of these moments never became more than murmurs. The isolation that bred them also, paradoxically, worked against them. For men adrift together for years had few illusions about where a mutiny might lead them, and fewer options for escape even if it succeeded. The captain bore his own private version of this burden, and it was, in its way, heavier than any borne by the men before the mast. He alone held the full weight of command, the navigation, the discipline, the decision of when to cruise and when to give chase, when to risk the boats in weather that gave him pause, when to press on toward a whaling ground that might yield nothing at all. He was responsible, in the plainest sense, for dozens of lives, men whose wives and children waited in ports he might not see again for years, and every choice he made was shadowed by that responsibility. Captains often took their meals alone, by custom and by necessity, for familiarity with the crew was thought to undermine the authority a captain needed to hold absolute in a moment of crisis. This distance, useful as it was to command, exacted its own cost in loneliness, a loneliness compounded by his own separation from family, for many captains brought their wives aboard on longer voyages rather than endure years apart, and even then, a wife's presence did little to ease the solitary nature of command itself. A captain's journal, where one survives, often shows a man wrestling privately with doubts he could never voice to his crew, worry over dwindling provisions, uncertainty about a course, grief carried silently for a child born and perhaps already grown before his return. Illness, too, found its way into the long isolation, and the ship's limited medicine chest was rarely equal to what the sea demanded of it. Scurvy crept in on voyages where fresh provisions ran short, and citrus was not renewed at port calls, the gums softening, the limbs aching, a man's strength leaving him by degrees, until even simple work became a trial. Injuries from the hunt, a crushed hand from a fouled line, a broken rib from a boat's sudden capsize, a deep gash from a flensing spade, were treated by whatever rough surgery the mate or captain could manage, sometimes guided by nothing more than a worn manual and years of accumulated practice. Infection was a persistent fear, for a wound that festered in the damp confines of a forecastle could take a man's life as surely as any harpooned whale could take a boat. And there was little to be done for it beyond cleaning, binding. Death aboard a whaler, when it came from illness or accident, rather than the hunt itself, was marked with quiet ceremony, a few words read over the rail, the body given to the water, the log noting the loss in a single restrained line before returning, inevitably, to the business of the voyage. And through all of it, men wrote letters, though the writing of a letter at sea was an act suspended in a strange uncertainty, for there was no telling when or if it would ever reach the hands it was meant for. A whaleman might compose pages to a wife or mother, sealing them carefully, entrusting them to the captain's care in hope of a passing ship bound for home, or a port call where the mail might finally be handed off to some agent who would see it carried onward. Many of these letters waited a year or more before delivery passed from vessel to vessel across oceans, arriving at last in a home that had, by then, endured months of silence and worry in between. Some letters never arrived at all, lost with the ship that carried them or misplaced in the long chain of hands through which they passed, and a family might wait through an entire winter for a voice that had already, unbeknownst to them, gone quiet beneath the waves. The letters that did survive the journey speak again and again of endurance rather than despair. A man reporting himself well, the voyage going as expected, the barrels filling slowly, and beneath the plain, careful sentences, an ache for the ordinary comforts of home that no amount of scrimshaw or hymn-singing could entirely soothe. Not every voyage ended in the slow, ordinary accumulation of oil and the counting of months until home. For some ships, and for the men aboard them, the sea revealed a different face entirely, one that no amount of preparation, skill, or prayer could turn aside. These were the voyages that whaling communities spoke of, only quietly, in low voices near the hearth. The stories told not to frighten children, but to remind them of what the ocean could do when it chose. Every whaling port carried such stories in its memory, carved into gravestones that marked no actual grave, inscribed in ledgers with the single word that closed a family's hope as firmly as any door: lost. The dangers were manifold, and they rarely announced themselves in advance. A sudden squall could rise from a clear horizon within the space of an hour, transforming a calm sea into a churning grey violence that tested the limits of hull and rigging alike. Ice, in the northern grounds, moved with a patience that was its own kind of menace, closing slowly around a ship that had ventured too far, too late in the season, until the vessel found itself locked in a white silence from which there was no sailing free. And then there was the whale itself, the very creature the ship had come so far to find, which on rare and terrible occasions turned from prey to adversary, and did so with a force that no gun or lance could answer. It is this last danger that gave whaling its most enduring tale of disaster, one that travelled through the trade for generations afterward as both warning and reckoning. In the autumn of 1820, a whale ship out of Nantucket, well-built and well-crewed, was working the far waters of the Pacific when her boats lowered for a pod of sperm whales spotted from the masthead. The chase went as such. Chases had gone 1,000 times before. The boats pulling hard, the harpoons finding their mark. The sea churned white with the whale's fear and fury. But among the pod was a bull of extraordinary size, larger than any the officers had seen taken. And this whale did not flee as the others had. It turned, faced the ship itself, floating at a distance, and after a long moment of stillness that the survivors would later describe as unnatural, almost deliberate, the whale drove itself forward through the water with tremendous speed and struck the vessel's bow with a force that split her timbers as though they were kindling. The ship began taking water immediately, and within minutes it was clear she could not be saved. The crew, some 20 men in all, managed to gather what provisions they could: hardtack, water, navigational instruments, a few sextants and charts, before the vessel rolled and settled beneath the waves, leaving them adrift in 3 small whaleboats, thousands of miles from any charted shore. What followed was not a swift tragedy, but a slow one, stretched across nearly 3 months of open ocean. And it is this slowness that makes the story endure in memory long after the shock of the whale's attack has faded. The men faced an impossible calculation from the first hour. The nearest islands, they believed, were inhabited by peoples rumoured, likely wrongly, to practice cannibalism. And so the captain made the fateful decision to sail instead for South America, a course that would take far longer and demand far more of their dwindling supplies. It was a decision born of the era's ignorance and fear, and it would cost lives that a shorter, more direct course might have spared. The boats separated in the vast expanse of ocean, some found eventually, others never seen again, and the men who remained watched their rations shrink day by day, the biscuit crumbling to dust, the water rationed to sips that could barely wet a parched tongue. What happened in those boats as weeks became months is recorded in survivors' own words, accounts given upon their eventual rescue and later published that spoke with plain and terrible honesty of hunger's slow erosion of hope and eventually of the unthinkable choices that starvation forces upon those who wish only to see home again. Men died of exposure and thirst. The living, faced with no other means of survival, resorted to what the era's whalers called the custom of the sea, the consumption of the dead, and in the most desperate boat, the drawing of lots to determine who among the living might be sacrificed so that others could continue. It is a detail that sits uneasily in any telling of the whaling trade, and yet it belongs to the honest record of what the ocean could demand of men pushed beyond every ordinary limit of endurance. Of the 20 who had set out in the boats, only a handful survived to be found, first by a passing ship far to the south, gaunt and barely coherent, their eyes fixed on some middle distance no other man could see, and later, weeks after, a second and even more diminished remnant discovered by another vessel that happened by whatever grace guides such things to cross their path. The rescued men were brought home eventually to Nantucket, where their story spread first in whispers and then in the written accounts that would preserve it for all the generations of whalers who came after, not merely as a tale of horror, though it was certainly that, but as a lesson etched into the trade's collective memory about the limits of the ship, the whale and the human body when the sea decided to turn cruel. This was not the only disaster of its kind, though it remains the most remembered. Whaling registries from ports along the New England coast, and later from ports in Britain, Norway, and the Pacific Islands that joined the trade, recorded losses with a grim regularity that any honest history must acknowledge. Ships crushed in the ice of Arctic and Antarctic waters, their hulls unable to withstand pressure that could splinter oak as easily as ice itself splintered under the sun. Ships that simply sailed out one season and were never seen again, their fate never confirmed by any survivor's account or any wreckage washed ashore, entered into the record with only the barest details: the vessel's name, her captain, her home port, and the single devastating word that closed the entry: lost. No further explanation offered, because none could be given. The sea had simply taken them and kept its silence. Families in whaling towns lived always with the knowledge of this possibility, however much they pushed it to the edges of daily thought. A wife saying farewell to her husband on the wharf understood in some quiet chamber of her mind that the ship might not return, that she might, in the fullness of time, become one of the widows who climbed to the widow's walk each evening, not from any real expectation of seeing a sail on the horizon, but because the climbing itself had become a form of grief that had nowhere else to settle. The children of such towns grew up understanding this too, in the way children absorb what adults try to shield them from, and it shaped something quiet and resilient in the character of every whaling community, a stoicism born not of indifference to loss, but of long familiarity with it. The disasters, when they became known, did leave their mark on the practice of whaling itself, though the changes came slowly and unevenly, as such changes so often do. Owners began in later decades to require sturdier construction for vessels bound for the ice grounds, hulls reinforced against the particular violence of pack ice. Captains grew more cautious, some of them about pursuing whales of unusual size or evident aggression, though the temptation of a large kill's substantial oil yield often outweighed caution in the moment of the chase. Navigational knowledge improved, charts grew more accurate, and rescue networks between whaling vessels, an informal but real code of mutual aid at sea, grew somewhat more reliable, so that a boat in distress had marginally better odds of being found by a passing ship than it might have decades before. None of this made the sea any less capable of cruelty. It only meant that men went out into that cruelty slightly better prepared, slightly more aware of what could happen, though awareness itself has never been a defense against the ocean's indifference. And still, for every disaster that left survivors to tell its story, there were ships that vanished, leaving nothing behind at all. No wreckage, no boat, no letter, no final testimony from any man who had sailed aboard her. These are the entries in the old registries that carry the heaviest quiet, because they resist even the grim satisfaction of explanation. A storm might be presumed, or an iceberg, or some catastrophic failure of the hull in waters too deep and too far from any shipping lane to ever yield an answer. But presumption is not knowledge, and the families of such ships were left, not with grief exactly, but with something harder to bear, an absence with no edges, no final moment to mourn, only the slow and endless waiting that eventually calcified into acceptance without ever quite becoming certainty. The ship had sailed, the ship had not returned. Between those two facts lay an ocean's worth of unanswered questions, and the whaling trade, for all its careful record-keeping, could offer nothing more than the word itself, entered in ink that has long since faded but remains legible still. In old ledgers kept in museum archives, a quiet monument to every voyage that simply ended in silence. There came a day, after so many days, that the men had stopped counting them individually and had begun instead to measure time in seasons and in the slow rising of the hold's contents. When the captain walked the length of the ship with a particular stillness in his bearing and called the mates to him, and spoke the words that every man aboard had been waiting to hear without quite allowing himself to hope for them. The hold was full, or full enough. The casks of oil stood tier upon tier below decks, dark and heavy and sealed against the light, and the bone lay bundled and stowed wherever space permitted, and the ship herself sat lower in the water than she had sat in years, her lines changed by the accumulated weight of everything the sea had given up to her. The captain had made his calculations, as captains always did, weighing the fullness of the hold against the dwindling provisions, against the age of the rigging, against some private accounting of ambition and caution that he alone carried and rarely spoke aloud. And, on this day, in these waters, under this particular sky, he judged that enough had been taken. The order was given, quietly, without ceremony, the way all the truly important orders aboard a whaling ship tended to be given. The helm came over, the yards were braced round, and for the first time in years, measured not in months, but in the slow accumulation of an entire portion of a man's working life, the ship's bow pointed toward home. The change in the crew was not immediate, nor was it uniform, but it moved through the vessel in the days that followed, like warmth returning to a body long numbed by cold. Men who had grown accustomed to a kind of patient endurance, who had learned to measure their lives in watches and in the small rituals of shipboard survival, found themselves now permitted to think of things they had set aside as too painful to dwell upon during the long months of the hunt. Wives, children who had been infants when the ship departed and who would now be walking, speaking, forgetting perhaps the shape of their father's face. Parents grown older in the telling of letters that arrived, when they arrived at all, months after they had been written, carrying news already stale by the time it reached hands calloused by tar and rope. The men spoke of these things now in low voices during the off-watch hours, cautiously, as though joy too openly displayed might curse the voyage home, the way overconfidence was said to curse the hunt itself. There was a superstition among sailors that a ship rejoicing too soon invited misfortune, and so the optimism that moved through the crew was cautious, held at arm's length, tested gently before it was allowed to take root. Alongside the thoughts of home came calculations of a more practical sort. For every man aboard a whaler sailed not for wages in the ordinary sense, but for a lay, a fractional share of the voyage's proceeds, determined by his rank and his contract. And now that the hold's contents could be estimated with something like confidence, the men began, quietly and separately, to do the arithmetic of their own futures. The green hands who had signed for the smallest shares totaled their portions against the debts they had accumulated at the outfitter's store before departure, debts for clothing and tobacco, and the small comforts advanced against wages not yet earned. And many found, even in this early reckoning, that the sum remaining to them would be slight. Season's labor purchased for little more than passage and experience. The seasoned hands, the boat steerers, and the harpooners whose skill had filled the casks, now stowed below, calculated more favorably, though even they understood that a lay was never a fortune, only a portion, and that the true wealth of the voyage would flow elsewhere, to the owners who had financed the ship and never smelled the try-works smoke, and to the captain, whose share dwarfed all others combined. Still, the calculations were made, and remade and made again, in the manner of men who had little else to occupy their minds besides the wind and the water and the growing nearness of everything they had left behind. The return voyage itself retraced in reverse much of what the outward passage had already demanded of them. The same latitudes had to be crossed, the same capes rounded, the same belts of calm and storm endured a second time, as though the ocean required a kind of toll, paid twice for every voyage undertaken upon it. The men who had rounded the great capes outward bound now rounded them again homeward, and found the experience no less demanding for its familiarity. If anything, the storms encountered on the return leg seemed almost personally aimed, as though the sea resented the ship's evident intention to escape it. The doldrums that had tested their patience on the outward voyage tested it again, the ship lying becalmed under a punishing sun, while the men, so close now to everything they desired, chafed at every hour of delay with an impatience sharper than any they had felt before. For a man can endure almost anything so long as he does not yet see the shore. But the sight of nearing land, even imagined, transforms every remaining obstacle into an agony. The captain, aware of this, kept the men occupied as best he could, for idle hands so near to home bred a particular kind of restlessness that no amount of discipline could fully suppress. And then, on a morning indistinguishable in its early light from 100 mornings that had come before it, the masthead lookout called down not a whale's spout, but a line of coast, faint and blue-grey along the horizon, and the word passed through the ship with an electricity that no whale sighting had ever quite matched. Land. Men left their berths who were not on watch, climbed the rigging without orders to see for themselves, stood at the rail in silence, broken only by the occasional murmured confirmation, as though speaking too loudly might cause the vision to dissolve. Some among them, the older hands who had made this passage more than once, watched the coastline with a kind of wary tenderness, knowing already what the younger men had not yet learned, that the land waiting for them was not the land they had left, that years away changed a place as surely as they changed a man, and that the harbor they were sailing toward held both everything they had longed for and things they were not yet prepared to face. The ship came in slowly, working its way up the familiar channel with a pilot's guidance, past headlands and markers the older hands recognized by instinct rather than sight, until at last the town itself came into view, its rooftops and steeples arranged in a silhouette burned into memory across years of absence. And for many of the men, the sight produced not the unrestrained joy they had imagined during the long months at sea, but something quieter, more disorienting, a kind of disbelief that the town could look so nearly the same while they themselves had been so thoroughly altered by everything the voyage had asked of them. They stood at the rail as strangers to their own homecoming. uncertain for a moment whether the men who had left this harbour years before still existed at all, or whether the sea had made of them someone else entirely wearing familiar names. The homecomings themselves, when they came, were as varied as the men who lived them. Wives who had raised children alone for years now stood on the wharves searching the faces of returning sailors for a husband whose features had softened in memory into something almost unrecognizable when set against the weathered, sun-darkened man who finally stepped ashore. Children who had been told stories of a father at sea regarded these strangers with the shy suspicion children reserve for adults they have been instructed to love without having been given the chance to know. Parents who had aged visibly in the interval, whose hair had greyed and whose steps had slowed, embraced sons who returned taller, harder, changed in ways no letter could have adequately conveyed. And for some men, the harbour held no one waiting at all, a father dead in the interval, a mother remarried, a sweetheart who had grown weary of waiting and had given her hand to someone who did not smell perpetually of oil and tar. These men walked the streets of their own hometown with the peculiar loneliness of a stranger in a familiar place, finding the taverns changed, the faces altered, the rhythms of a life ashore, no longer quite fitting the shape of a man who had spent years learning to live by the demands of wind and whale instead. For all of them, though, the voyage was not truly finished until the accounts were settled, and so in the days following the ship's arrival, the men made their way one by one to the counting house, where the owner's agents kept their ledgers. To learn at last what the voyage had actually yielded them in the terms that mattered most immediately to a man returning after years of labour. The process was slow and exacting, for the value of the oil had to be assessed against the market price at the moment of sale, the bone weighed and valued separately, the ship's expenses and the outfitter's debt subtracted before any lay could be calculated in earnest. Some men left the counting house with sums that, while modest by the standards of merchants or shipowners, represented genuine wealth to a man who had never held so much money at once. Enough perhaps to purchase a small house, to marry, to set himself up in some trade ashore that promised a life no longer governed by the demands of the sea. Others left with considerably less, their shares consumed almost entirely by debts incurred before the ship had even cleared the harbour, so that years of labour and danger yielded, in the final accounting, barely enough to clothe them for the winter ahead. And a few, having calculated their lay against their circumstances, concluded that the sea, whatever it had cost them, remained the only trade they knew well enough to return to, and began already, within weeks of stepping ashore, to inquire after ships preparing for their next departure, as though the land itself, for all its comforts, could not quite hold a man who had given so many years of his life to the deep water and the long chase, and had found, whether he wished to admit it or not, that some part of himself had remained out there, still listening for the cry from the masthead. The oil that filled the casks below decks, that had cost so many months and so much labour to win from the vast bodies of whales taken in distant waters, did not remain long in the ports where it was landed. It travelled onward, as it was always meant to, carried by wagon and rail and coastal schooner, to cities the whalemen themselves would likely never see. It found its way into the lamps of parlours and counting houses, into the street lamps that pushed back the darkness along avenues in Boston and New York and London, into the delicate mechanisms of clocks and watches that required an oil fine enough not to gum their gears, into the machinery of mills that spun and wove through nights made possible only by the burning of what had once swum silent and enormous through cold water. A whale killed off the coast of Japan might within 2 years be burning quietly in a window in Liverpool, its light falling across a family at supper who could not have named the ship that brought it, nor the men who had rowed toward it in small boats with harpoons in hand, nor the specific reek of the try-works that had rendered it down. The oil did its work invisibly as commodities do, severed from the labor and the danger and the waiting that had produced it, becoming simply light, simply the smooth turning of a gear, simply warmth in a cold room. This was the strange arithmetic of the trade, that so much of a man's life, so many years given to the ocean, resolved finally into gallons and barrels, into a substance that would be consumed and forgotten within a single season, leaving no trace of the voyage that had provided it. For decades, this arithmetic sustained entire towns. New Bedford and Nantucket, and lesser ports beside them, grew wealthy on the trade, their harbors crowded with ships outfitting or unloading, their counting houses busy with the accounting of lays and shares, their churches and schools and fine houses built on oil and bone. A young man walking those streets in the middle of the 19th century might have believed the trade eternal. So thoroughly had it woven itself into the fabric of those places. The smell of it in the air near the wharves, the rhythm of departures and returns that governed the town's sense of time, the widows and the wives who had learned to measure their lives in voyages rather than years. But the trade was not eternal. It carried within it the seeds of its own ending, in the diminishing numbers of whales in waters that had once seemed inexhaustible, in the voyages that grew longer and longer as ships were forced to search farther for their prey, in the slow arithmetic of diminishing returns that no amount of skill or daring could entirely overcome. And then, within the span of a single generation, a substance was drawn up out of the ground in Pennsylvania that could be refined into a light as bright as any whale oil, at a fraction of the cost, without the necessity of ships or harpoons or years at sea. Petroleum did not announce itself as an ending. It arrived quietly, as innovations often do, gradually replacing whale oil in lamp after lamp, mill after mill, until the trade that had defined those towns for the better part of a century found itself without the market that had sustained it. The decline was not sudden, but it was thorough. Whaling did not vanish in a single year. Some ships continued to sail for whales well into the later decades of the century, and the trade persisted in diminished form even as its economic centrality faded. But the great age of it, the age that had built those towns and defined those lives, drew slowly to a close. The wharves that had once been crowded with ships grew quiet. The counting houses closed or turned to other business. Young men who might once have signed articles for a whaling voyage went instead to work in mills or moved west or found their way into other trades entirely. And the towns that had depended on whaling settled into a kind of afterlife, their fine houses remaining as monuments to a wealth whose source had dried up, their harbors given over to other. Humbler traffic. Some of these towns reinvented themselves, finding new industries to sustain them. Others simply diminished, their populations dwindling as the young left for opportunities elsewhere, until what remained was a town that seemed, in certain lights, to be waiting for ships that would never come again. The ships themselves met various fates, as ships always do when the trade that built them no longer requires their service. Many were broken up for their timber and metal, dismantled on the very beaches where they had once been built, their planks and ribs sold for whatever price they could fetch, their names entered into the record one final time as a notation of disposal rather than departure. Others were sold to other trades, their whaling gear stripped away, repurposed as cargo vessels or fishing boats, carrying different freight through different waters, their history as whalers surviving only in the memory of harbor old-timers who could point to a hull and say that one hunted whales once, though few who saw them afterward would have known it to look at them. A small number were preserved, brought into museums, or maintained as historical vessels, their decks open now to visitors rather than to the labor of trying out, their holds displaying instead of concealing the tools of the trade they once practiced. But most simply passed into the ordinary obscurity that claims the majority of ships that have ever sailed noted in registries that grew increasingly sparse in their entries, sold from owner to owner until the paper trail thinned and finally vanished, their ultimate fates unknown or unrecorded, their names surviving if at all. Only as entries in customs records or newspaper notices of arrival and departure that no one thought at the time worth preserving with any particular care. And yet the sea and the historians together have continued, even into recent years, to yield up fragments of these voyages that had seemed entirely lost. Divers exploring wrecks off distant coasts have occasionally found the unmistakable remains of whaling vessels, tripods corroded but recognizable, the iron fittings of harpoons, the ballast stones that had once steadied a hull, now scattered across a sea floor, far from the port that had launched it. Logbooks thought destroyed have surfaced in attics and estate sales, their pages brittle but legible, offering, in the terse hand of some long-dead mate, an account of a single day's chase, a gale survived, a death recorded without ceremony, because ceremony was a luxury the sea did not often allow. Museums and historical societies have pieced together, from such fragments, a fuller picture than any single voyage's records could have provided, the ordinary texture of a life that was, for those who lived it, simply life, whatever it might seem to us now, across the distance of a century and a half. Each such discovery is small, incomplete, resistant to easy narrative, and yet each adds something to the accumulated record of what it meant to have gone to sea in pursuit of whales. A record that will never be complete, that will always contain more silence than sound, more names lost than names recovered, but that continues slowly to grow. It is worth returning now to the image with which this account began. The quiet harbour at dawn, the water still, the light not yet fully risen, the town beginning to stir toward a day whose ordinary rhythms would, for a certain number of its young men, mark the last morning spent entirely on land for years to come. That harbour, or one very much like it, exists still, though it no longer serves the purpose it once did. The wharves remain, some of them, though the ships that tie up at them now carry pleasure craft or lobster gear, rather than the great, outfitted whalers of a century and a half ago. The warehouses that once stored casks of oil have been converted, many of them, into other uses, or stand empty, or have been torn down entirely to make way for buildings with no memory of what preceded them. If you were to stand on such a wharf at dusk, as the light fails and the water darkens and the gulls settle for the night, you might feel, if you knew the history of the place, something of what has been lost there. Not merely a trade, not merely an industry, but a whole way of measuring a life, a whole vocabulary of departure and return and waiting. That has passed as thoroughly out of the world as the whales that were hunted have, in certain populations, passed out of the oceans, where they once swam in numbers difficult now to imagine. There is little that can be said, in the end, that will resolve the strangeness of what these men did and what it cost them and what came of it. They went out in small boats after the largest animals the world contained, worked by hand at labor that broke bodies and claimed lives with a regularity the record only partially preserves, and brought home a substance that lit the world for a while and was then forgotten as newer substances took its place. The sea did not care what was asked of it then or now, and gave up its creatures, and occasionally its ships, and occasionally its men, with the same vast indifference it has always shown to whatever is thrown against it. And yet the ambition persisted, voyage after voyage, generation after generation, as though something in human nature could not help reaching toward what was largest and most dangerous and most difficult to obtain, regardless of the cost, regardless of the eventual obsolescence of the prize. The harbour grows quiet now in the evening, as it always does, the tide moving in and out with the same patience it kept before any ship was built to cross it. And if there is a lesson in this quiet, it is perhaps only that the sea outlasts every industry raised against it, and that somewhere beneath its indifferent surface, the old voyages continue. Pont in whatever way lost things continue, waiting to be found again by those willing to listen for them. If you have enjoyed this passage into a vanished world, you are welcome to return whenever you wish for more lost voyages.